Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Weed Seed Destruction webinar. My name's Tom Allen-Stevens. I lead the British On-Farm Innovation Network. And what we have for you today are the first results from the very first on-farm trial of the Redicop seed control unit in Europe. I think I can say that anyway. So earlier this year, Redicop, with the help of their import partner, Auria Agriculture, brought over from Canada 3 seed control units, SCUs, and fitted them to the combines of 3 UK farmers for an on-farm project to explore the effectiveness of harvest weed seed control. NIAB, one of the foremost authorities on this subject in the UK, came up with a protocol to assess this, monitored the weeds with the help of 3 farmers. And it's the initial results we have for you today. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. But before we start, I'd just like to say a huge thank you to Redicop and to Auria for committing the time and the investment into making this project happen. And I'd also like to say a big thank you to NIAB, who have likewise invested in some really important research into this area that simply hasn't been done before. Now, I'm just going to share my screen, if you'll bear with me. So let's have a look at the agenda. After a short introduction from myself, we'll go straight into the trial results from Will Smith of NIAB. Then we're going to have we'll have a chat with the 3 farmers themselves. So that's Ted Holmes, who's a Velcourt farm manager in Warwickshire, Adam Driver from Driver Farms in Suffolk, and then Jake Freestone from Overbury Enterprises in Worcestershire. And then Trevor Thiessen, the founder and president of Redicop Manufacturing in Canada, it will be joining us as well. And also Will Smith will come back in to join the discussion. And we'll open it out to your questions. So you'll see at the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A and a chat box. So please enter your questions in there, and we'll come back to you. We'll try and answer as many of those questions as we can during the session. But don't worry if your questions aren't answered, because we'll come back to you with answers. So the 3 farmers, as I said, there's Ted Holmes in Warwickshire. Now he's got a New Holland CR990. And then we've got Jake Freestone in Worcestershire. And his combine is a John Deere S685i. And then we've got Adam Driver, and he's got a Claas Lexion 8800. And the exciting thing about Adam's combine is it's the first Claas combine in Europe to be fitted with an SCU. So fitting the SCU itself, well, I mean, it was quite a task, I can tell you, fitting it to the European spec of model. But we had some brilliant help from Claas and from John Deere and from New Holland and their local teams. And Redicop and Auria really sort of pulled out the stops to make sure that everything was ready in time for harvest. And you can see on the slide here the unit itself. So that's the unit that was fitted to Jake's John Deere combine. And it takes the chaff stream and it puts it through, you can see in that diagram, it puts it through a series of columns. And the idea is that it beats about the weed seed and it hits it 4 times, and that makes it unviable. And perhaps we'll hear a bit more from Trevor about this a bit later on. So the weed monitoring, that's the really important part. I mean, the significant thing about this is that this research really hasn't been done in the UK before on harvest weed seed control. And there's Will, who's measuring some sterile meadow brome there, I think. I won't say too much about that because obviously we'll hear it from Will in a minute. But just to flag up that the main seeds that we were looking at on these 3 farms were meadow brome and also some sterile brome as well, I believe. Italian ryegrass, that was the real bugbear at Ted's farm in Warwickshire. And then blackgrass, that was the weed that one of the weeds at Adam's farm that he was keen to have a look at. By the way, that picture isn't actually Adam's blackgrass, it's just in case Adam was wondering. Oh, hang on a second. Sorry, we'll stop there. So anyway, without further ado, I'm going to ask Will to join us. Could you turn on your video, Will, and join us?
Indeed, Tom. Good evening, everybody.
Great.
I will begin to share my screen. 1 second. Okay. So yeah, so these are the initial results from Harvest 2022 from the project that that Tom has just fantastically introduced. So I'll go straight into it. Obviously, plenty of time for Q&A later. One of the first things I really wanted to sort of mention and to really drive home was the fact that there's a lot of factors that combine to influence the seeds and the weeds that we see in the following season. And really, this is what we're talking about with an SCU unit. We are really trying to control the weeds for the next season rather than necessarily derive any direct benefit for the current season of cropping. So in terms of factors that obviously influence that, we have our in-season control, which obviously currently we're very highly reliant on our herbicides for, certainly conventional systems. And then in terms of actually in particular reference to the SCUs themselves, it's about getting the seeds into the combine. So seed retention is incredibly important on the weeds themselves. So across different species, which I'll talk about shortly, we will see different levels of seed retention. There's then obviously some other losses as part of the combining system. So we have potential losses on the header. And again, these are likely to vary between species. And then also seed in the grain, whereby it's just passing through the sieves alongside the grain and ends up in the tank. And from various other work, we do know that this is somewhere between 1 and 3% in some cases. We obviously have in this particular example some mortality from the SCU. And if we're talking about numbers, it's been widely proven that these units are capable of destroying over 95% of seeds that do pass through. So hence, it's really important to actually get them into the SCU as a starting point. But when we're talking about the numbers that we'll look at tonight, which are mainly the seedlings observed in the following season's crops, so that's actually this autumn that we've done those assessments, the seed bank has a huge role to play in what we see in that year. And hence, some of the results we'll see have been strongly influenced by that. So really important to take note of this sort of entire process up to the numbers that we'll see shortly. So if we start with some of the potential seeds available for combining, so this included some sampling by our farmers by the farmers themselves. So we did some sampling of seed heads long before harvest, back in May and June, when they just begin to come out into full flower, but at a point where we can identify seeds to understand the maximum number of seeds available to the combine. And then on the day of harvest, each of our 3 farmers were kind enough to go out and harvest 20 seed heads from each field, and from which we've managed to derive some of these potential seeds available for the combine. So if we go through it on a species level, so in Suffolk, in particular, we had this blackgrass problem. Was one of the sort of focuses for Adam's farm. And in this season, we seem to have had a much higher result than we've seen in the past, and certainly anecdotally that we've seen with blackgrass. With nearly 50 or just over 50% of seed was still on the head at harvest time. Now, obviously, this is 3 fields, but on 1 farm in 1 season. But certainly, it does make us begin to think that actually possibly there is more available to an SCU unit for blackgrass than we sometimes think. And we need to consider how the effect of the summer of 2022 and these really hot and dry conditions that were record breaking on many levels have had an influence on some of these figures. For Italian ryegrass, we've got 2 numbers there. Those represent figures derived from crops in winter barley, so that's the 62.3%, and in spring barley, so that's slightly higher figure, 87%, which was incredibly high. Out of all the species and crops that we sampled from. I think one thing to note, though, is that having gone through the samples, there's a huge number of non-viable seeds just visually at this point, where actually there was no seed fill. And again, this is likely to have been some sort of situation related to the hot and dry conditions of the season. For meadow brome, this is we've got 2 sites with significant weed problem here, and they tie up really nicely in terms of the figures derived. But 60%, just over 60% of seed was retained on the weed, and therefore was sort of as a proxy available for the combine and available for the seed unit. So those are all actually really positive numbers. So the blackgrass is a bit of a surprise, but the Italian ryegrass and meadow brome are showing no surprises. And the wild oat figure of 22% retained, again, is of no surprise from other work around the world, but really does demonstrate that this SEU solution is not one that is going to be applicable to all weeds. And wild oats is a prime example of this, where, let's say, 20% of weed seed was available to the combine, high levels of seed shed prior to harvest.
Will, sorry to interrupt. Can you hear me all right? Yeah, I just wanted to ask, on that slide, you've got Cambridgeshire. I mean, we've got the 3 farms were Suffolk, Warwickshire and Worcestershire. Could you just explain why we've got the Cambridgeshire?
Sorry, of course, yes. So alongside the 3 farms that Tom introduced, Redacom have also fitted a unit to the commercial combine at NIAB at our Cambridge site. So we actually have 4 sites in total. Although the site at Cambridge has, relatively speaking, less weed, and it's being used to trial some other parts of SCUs, which we'll come on to later. But yeah, no, sorry, yeah, thanks for clarifying. So one thing was really interesting, and this is data prior to putting the combine in the field, but this is for both blackgrass and meadow brome from Adams Farm, so over in Suffolk. And this was where we are pre-sampling of seed heads in each of the fields. And we've sampled both behind where the combine was due to go, but also, let's say, 2 meters out from the center and 4 meters out from the center. Adam uses a controlled traffic system and has done so for about 5 years on these fields. But he's also combined this with absolutely no tillage at all. A very low disturbance drilling system, and this has seen a real concentration of our weed seeds into the center behind the combine. So for meadow brome, as I've just demonstrated with the seed shed data or lack of seed shed, this is not entirely unexpected. We know that there's a lot of seed available to the combine, and therefore there has been some movement of it across the field, and it's been concentrating behind the combine. However, we've also seen the same effect, although possibly not quite such a strong relationship, but certainly there's the same concentration of the blackgrass seed. So this kind of does lend itself to believe that even if we are talking about this lower level of seed available, it's still having a fairly serious and meaningful movement around the field by the combine, and therefore if it's available for that purpose, then it's likely to be available for the SCU as well. So in terms of that's all dealt with the seed shed and what we've done there. This is just, again, a bit of a context type slide, just to, again, begin to encourage you to understand some of these concepts around when we start to talk about weed control over a number of years. And this idea of seed bank dynamics, this is work that was collected 3 or 4 years ago now, as part of a separate trial at Cambridge, specifically looking at blackgrass and partly with seed bank dynamics in blackgrass. But the blue bars are a system where we've had deep non-inversion, lots of soil mixing over a number of years, and then the orange bars is where we've had so just direct drilling for just 2 years. And this is very quickly, we've accumulated a vast density of seeds in this very top surface layer in that 0 to 5 centimeters, from which seeds can very readily germinate and infest any crop. Whereas the non-inversion system has had this, say, greater soil mixing deep within the profile, and to this 10 to 15 and 15 to 25 centimeter profiles, which the seeds are unavailable to be recruited into the following crop. So really this shows that obviously harvest weed seed control strategies are going to really strongly interact with this seed bank dynamic, particularly if we are using it in conjunction with no-till. Then hopefully we will begin to erode this top layer, this top surface layer. However, if we've already been practicing no-till for a number of years, even if we're getting good control of what is coming up, and therefore we're not seeing this in the field, we are likely to be accumulating a high density of seeds in this top layer, and therefore this will take time to erode. And therefore the first 2 or 3, maybe even 4 years of using SCU, and even where we are really nailing down our seed return to very high levels, so 95% plus, then we are still going to be seeing weeds emerging. So this is sort of just to say, add some context to the results that we'll see shortly. So let's come on to that. So this is some data from Gloucestershire. So this is the use of the SCU in a field that was infested with blackgrass. And this is, again, so this is blackgrass seedlings assessed following the use of the SCU in the following autumn. So this is kind of what we expected from blackgrass. It's a seed that in general is much lower density, and so much lower levels of seed shed, so high levels of seed shed, much lower levels of seed retention, but also has high levels of seed bank numbers and has an affinity to be able to maintain viability in the seed bank over a number of seasons. So whether we've had the seed bank in SCU engaged or not has had very little difference. In fact, say slight increase, but I will caveat that with field variation. And with our previous assessments, we did pick up that these strips where it was going to be engaged were really slightly higher. So we've seen no net change in our blackgrass population as a result of the SCU. However, as I say, this is a work in progress, and I think that in this season we've only looked at blackgrass in winter wheat, in particular in an autumn sown crop. And I think that what we haven't got to yet, and this is going to come for next season, is try to look at it in some of these other crops, so spring barley in particular, and even winter barley, where we know that the amount of seed that is available to the combine is higher from work in this project, but also work from previous work within the literature that is in the public domain. So we'll go on to Italian ryegrass, and as Tom said right at the beginning, this was always going to be something that was it's a real troublesome weed for TED, but not only TED, it's a weed that is growing in severity in the UK. It's very difficult to control. It can spread incredibly rapidly, very similar to blackgrass, but doesn't respond in the same way to some of the cultural controls. Some of the issues with resistance, we're picking up a very strong drivers in terms of how it's going to accumulate in fields and become a greater problem in the next few years. It's a really important weed to find some alternative strategies on. And again, so it's a single year. This is just from one of TED's fields. And across the 3 strips or the 3 pairs of strips, we've seen a mean reduction of 60% reduction in seedlings in the following crop, which was or is currently is in oilseed rape. So I think a really positive reduction in terms of the mean reduction in seedlings. I think it's really something that we need to consider, that this is a really big problem weed for TED. And therefore his seed bank for this type of weed is going to be very high, and that's why we're still seeing quite high numbers emerging, even where we've had it engaged. But over a number of years, we would expect to see this sort of begin to strongly erode. And there's already significant work out there that demonstrates that the control of the freshly set seed is obviously very important, but it is going to be methods that sort of effectively control the seed bank in combination are going to be really important to make this technology really thrive on farm. So the one example that we do have of spring cropping is at TED's, and it's really neat. So the previous work is in winter barley, this is in spring barley. The reductions are much smaller, which is interesting because, as I've said, the retention of the seed was much higher. However, there are some mitigating factors. We feel the area had been subsoiled, it had been the soil had been moved, and therefore we suspect there's been some introduction of seeds from a deeper soil profile, and also some of the seasonal effects on seed viability. I think briefly mentioned already, but some of these seeds that we'd already seen that from the weed seeds in the spring barley didn't appear to be particularly viable. So although there's this high retention, it's kind of irrelevant if they were never going to grow in the first place. But I think it still remains a really positive message that we are seeing reductions, and anything is better. Say this is all following all the other in-season controls. This is beginning to put the icing on the cake, as it were, in terms of our control. And then finally, our final real sort of target weed was meadow brome. This data comes from the site at Cambridge, which is a incredibly highly infested site of meadow brome. It's a site that we've tried to only consider cultural control, so it's not had any herbicides on it for the previous 4 years of sort of trials work that we've had in there. And from this season, we saw, I mean, relatively low, disappointing number, but 25% reduction in the ground cover from our meadow brome. Last year, this reduction of a similar assessment was 73%. So there's certainly something happening this year that has changed this efficacy. But really, for me, it sort of comes down to the absolute sheer number, the sheer density that we've got. This is a photo from part of the field where on the left-hand side, the seed mill, the SCU, was disengaged, and on the right-hand side, it was engaged. And although it's a snapshot, I think it's reasonably clear that there's significantly less weed on that right-hand side. For significantly less weed, there's still a significant amount of weed. And so if we sort of work through some of these sort of brief numbers, there were over 200 panicles per metre square last year of the brome. And it needs to be very clear that when we were starting with this high density of weeds, it's sort of a bad place to start with any control mechanism, is whether that's an SCU, whether that's herbicides, in-row cultivation, and therefore other sort of maybe more drastic action, more cultural action needs to be taken to drive down our weed population before any other control method is begun to be considered. So say adding numbers to this, these number of panicles means that even with the SCU engaged and operating at 95%, we think about the seeds, over 1,500 seeds a metre square will have been returned to this field, particularly in no-till situation. So it's sort of very, very little wonder that we have very low observed densities when we're working, very low observed differences when we're working these incredibly high densities. And that's why I sort of say, I make this point that really for no technology, however effective it is in isolation, if the other factors required for good control aren't going to be optimized, then our weed populations will tend to travel in a single direction, and that is often upwards. And therefore, really, we need to promote an integrated approach. It's absolutely necessary for the sort of future of our sustainable weed control, of which SCUs are absolutely a part, but they will support herbicides, and herbicides will support them in terms of the overall efficacy. I will finish on some work around some of the economics and some of the practical implications of bolting on an SCU to a combine. We're still working through some of the telematic data from the two farms, and I think we'll talk about that with the growers, because some of the comparisons are very difficult when we've got such a different year to that of previous years in terms of combine loading and how harvest actually occurred. So I'm sure we'll get to that. But at Cambridge in this year, we had two very similar fields, both being planted on the same date, same crop, same soil type, all this, were just meters apart. So what we did was we combined one of the fields with the SCU fully engaged for the entire field, and the other obviously without the SCU engaged at all. This is just a photo of the telemetry map. This is a fuel use, so it's meaningless in isolation, but the green is lower fuel use, and red around the headland is much higher fuel use. We kept the forward speed exactly the same for the entire field at a sort of a very stable 4.5K. So we're trying to make sure that we were operating this zone where the engine would not be ordinarily overloaded at any one point, and try to control all those variables around that. And so within this work, we we've managed to describe a 10% increase in fuel use associated with using the SCU, which is on par with previous work that sort of Redicop's talked about and previous work that they themselves have done. And this was related to just a 5% increase in overall engine load. Also, as I say, the average engine load with no SCU is 66%. So there's plenty of capacity in the combine to take on this engine load. I say within the parameters that we're operating in. I think one of the other things in terms of the economics is there's certainly some work to be done in the UK. There's some really good resources being produced by Australian researchers where harvest weed seed capture is a really integral part to some of their weed control strategies. But we'll need to make some adaptations for UK conditions, and this is what a lot of this data will hopefully that we generate will begin to sort of formulate and be used to drive some of these resources to sort of surround the raw data on weed efficacy with some of this cerebral type of data on what we might do and what it might look like for uptake on farm. So I'm sure I'm well over my time already. So a quick summary. It's clear there's sort of demonstration that reductions in weed populations are absolutely associated with the SCUs. The range of these are certainly need to be taken in context of seed banks and our previous season control, but certainly reductions are there. Reduction is obviously going to be compromised where you're going to be reducing the level of seed that actually goes into the combine, and typically this is going to be where low seed retention is observed, and we need to understand those factors and where we can optimize our cropping systems potentially to really drive ourselves to a sort of system that operates towards an SCU. The starting point is absolutely vital. If you're starting from an apocalypse, it will only ever end in disaster. And we need to consider some sort of level of time scale for both our expectations. We will have a seed bank of weeds, even if you're in really good control. You're often talking about sort of 10 to 15% of the seed bank is emerging at one time. So that will tell you how much weed you would like to have in your soils. And therefore, we might need to consider some sort of modelling activity. And again, really good work out of the States on this type of topic. It's just useful to determine how long we might need to be using the SCU for to really gain absolute benefit. And obviously, continuation of this study is, we would be really pleased that Redicop continued to support this to observe the cumulative effect of SCU use over a number of years. And hopefully across a wider range of conditions. So anyway, so back to you, Tom. Hopefully pick up some time.
Great. No, thank you very much for that, Will. That was really interesting. I mean, a couple of take-home figures that I gleaned from that: 60% of Italian ryegrass control there. That's really quite significant. And again, this is the first data that we've had from the UK for ryegrass specifically on a harvest weed seed control. The other interesting figure that I picked up there was more than 50% of blackgrass retained at harvest, which is much higher than I think we thought. This was in winter wheat. I mean, again, we can probably discuss this a little bit later on, but really interesting. But the interesting thing about that, as Will said, is that when it came to the actual results, not great control between engaged and disengaged, which seems to suggest that there's not a high amount of viability. So, I mean, that's something I think, Will would agree that there's an area for future research there, but we'll come back to that. Let's bring in the three farmers. So Ted, Jake, and Adam, if I could ask you to switch on your cameras and join us. Brilliant. Adam, are you there as well? Fantastic. Great. Well, look, guys, first of all, thank you so much for your involvement here, and putting yourselves forward. I'm not entirely sure you knew when you were putting yourselves forward within this, not just for, the use of your combines, but also your time as well. I know that all three of you put an awful lot of time into this and attention. So thank you very much, first of all, for that. But look, first of all, I'm sure one of the things that everyone wants to know is what it's like to operate, and particularly how costly is it to operate. I think Will touched on it earlier, and he's talked about a 10% fuel usage. So Ted, can I start with you? Do you want to just talk us through, what it's like to operate, and particularly, if you've got any figures on fuel usage and things like that?
Yes, evening everybody. I'll talk really in litres a hectare and fuel consumption with the SCU engaged and engaged, or disengaged and engaged. Then I think it's fair that you can then look back to your own machines at harvest, look at what you're drinking, cost of fuel. Again, if you bought early and were able to stock up before fuel rocketed, we all know running costs have gone through the roof recently. So in a 9-ton hectare crop of milling wheat, we were chopping the straw and running the SCU. Lovely hot conditions, grain moisture coming in at sort of 12.5 to 13.5%. This is per hectare. We were ranging anywhere from 18 to 21 litres of fuel a hectare. And again, backing up Will's figure earlier, you disengage the SCU, the fuel dropped from 10 to 12%. We noticed a bit of a spike in the evening when you'd lost the sun and the heat of the day, that the combine got a wee bit thirstier. But certainly combining wheat, I can back up what Will is saying. In a crop of X days wheat that was touching, well, it was up and over 11 tonne a hectare. I was swathing the straw there. That particular block, I do a straw for muck deal with a neighbour, running the SCU. We were drinking 17 to 20 litres a hectare. And again, we had a play, we dropped the SCU out and 10% down on fuel. I think relating back to what Will touched on earlier, and we saw the slide about the spring barley, I purposefully left that field as the last field of spring barley to cut. It's a filthy little field, and I didn't want, I'm desperately trying not to move the seed around the farm. And it's interesting that the incredibly hot, dry summer we've had, I certainly identified that a lot more seed had shed from the ryegrass here compared to earlier on in the crop of winter barley, where we were retaining a lot more seed. In terms of running the machine, incredibly easy to engage and disengage the SCU, easy to work on, pretty straightforward. We had a couple of niggles early on, teething problems. A lot of it actually was getting the straw out the back of the combine. We had to take out the accelerator belt that a New Holland rotary runs, purely because of the design and layout of bolting Ready Crops unit in. And we found in the heat of the day with some really brittle, dry winter barley straw, we were struggling just to get that out the back. But regular contact and communication with both Ready Crop in Canada and Dana and her colleague Bertrand in France with Aurea, fantastic. Learned a hell of a lot this summer. I think we've all got to accept conditions next year may well be very different, and it will be really interesting to see levels of control, how the combines do or don't like running the units. So yeah, the first indications this summer from my perspective really positive, but we've got a long way to go, and we need to really test it in some, be very interesting in some different conditions. But a thumbs up from me.
Great, thank you very much for that, Ted. That's a really thorough report. Adam, now one of the differences with your combine, Adam, is that on the Claas combine you couldn't disengage the unit, but I believe you've got a second combine on the farm, and I don't know whether you've managed to sort of, were you able to make any sort of assessment as to how much it was costing?
Not really at the moment. I didn't think it would be fair to try and compare it to the previous harvest, because the conditions are so good, and because I can't turn it on and off, obviously I can't really make an assumption. But going on what Ted said and what the other previous data, 10-12%, I think I can quite believe that.
So what was one of the remarkable things that you found about the SCU on your farm then?
Well, actually, for us, volunteer control has been really, really useful. Sort of an unforeseen thing I hadn't really thought about originally when we were looking into this idea. You know, because we're noting we're growing a lot of winter malting barley after wheat, and obviously that can volunteer wheat, especially on a year like we've had this year where it didn't rain really. There wasn't many volunteers growing anyway on non-SCU fields. So yeah, volunteer control has been very useful actually, and also in terms of minimising a green bridge, a cereal to cereal sort of green bridge as well. So that's been a bonus. And I mean, originally the other idea behind the SCU for us was sorry, it's just turns me off. It was for blackgrass, but also the brome and heading off any issues with ryegrass coming in, because I keep hearing about it, and that's probably going to be the next big problem for us, because no doubt we'll end up over this way. And it'd be I had in my mind setting that off before it becomes a problem, rather than what we've all done with blackgrass. It's just become a massive problem, and we've eventually changed after we've flogged every chemical to death. So
yeah, what's interesting about your system, Adam, is that it's called controlled traffic farming system, which I think Will highlighted with the weed count that he did, and how it fans out from the center of the combine. You know, you've got this concentration, this weed seed concentration in the chaff line behind the combine, which he confirmed with the weeds. I mean, did you actually see much difference in the blackgrass control?
Sorry, what do you mean in terms of control?
I mean, did in the 1 year of having the...
No, I can't see much difference yet. It's going to be, I think, in terms of finding the real benefits in terms of blackgrass and perhaps the brome, it's going to take 3 to 4 years to really pick it up. I mean, we're coming from quite a heavy seed bank, shall we speak, as we say. So we've got, basically, I got loads of blackgrass, so it's going to take a while to and lots of other methods as well to start getting that down. But that is one of the reasons that we wanted to try the SCU, because we've been controlled traffic for a while now. It's probably about 8-9 years actually. And we started observing this blackgrass in that, but we've only noticed it more since we've had this combine. But we've noticed this build up straight behind the combine, which I don't think it's because of the CTF. I think the controlled traffic is because it's in exactly the same place. It's showing us that it's happening, and that's what led me to believe that more was going through the combine than I had originally thought. And I mean, that 50% figure is, there was noticeably more blackgrass in the year than there would usually be, I think, this year, and I don't know why. But certain fields, some there was more in, very crop dependent. You know, going to a crop of spring oats and the blackgrass is all still in the ear, but you go into a crop of wheat at the end of August and there's nothing left. So it's it'd be interesting to try on some different crops as well, and see what levels we've got in them.
Great, thank you very much, Adam. Jake, how about yourself? Now, I think you had a bit of an issue because it was going to be fitted to your new combine, but that never appeared, and so they pulled out the stops and got it fitted to your old combine, I believe.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. Yeah, you're exactly right. So combine delayed due to tracks. So we were sort of parked up on Rotterdam Harbour for a considerable part of harvest. But as you say, Talis Amos Group, Dana, Bertrand did a magnificent job. So halfway through combining winter barley, we actually stopped combining, got a demonstrator in, one of the John Deere ones, and put the Redicop on our old combine, which thankfully we hadn't let leave the farm. So we used that for the rest of the season. At the end of the season, it came off and is now sitting on the 790 in the workshop ready to go. So it's been on 2 combines already. But to be fair, the actual process of installation and removal was relatively straightforward. So it was, yeah, it's not a big thing if you want to retrofit it, certainly to our combine.
Great. So tell me, have you done any assessment of how much it's cost you for fuel use? Any other observations?
Yeah, so pretty similar, really. I've been to have a little look round today, and we've got two fields, both of X days, cut on the 5th of August. We had one yielding 9.6, and that was running at 21.16 litres per hectare. That was with the SCU disengaged. When we put the SCU in a slightly bigger crop, 9.9, both around the 13% moisture, we were up to 23.52 litres. So again, a very similar 10% sort of increase in fuel use. I'm not sure about engine loading. I know from when I was sitting in the seat, the engine load seemed to be running higher than historically it would have been, which would explain why it's using a bit more fuel. So yeah, can concur kind of with the other guys, really.
Great. And what was it like to run? Any other observations at your end?
Relatively straightforward. The integration into the John Deere system worked fine. Maintenance was easy. One of the unforeseen issues, I guess, was the fact we had to push the steering axle, or push the wheels out on the back of the combine, which made it quite a lot wider than we thought, which has created an issue or two in moving around some of our narrow lanes, getting through and over cattle.
This is the rear axle width you're talking about here, aren't you?
Yes, it is.
To widen that out to accommodate the width of the Redicop unit. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's it. The drive of the Redicop unit is just down the left-hand side of the combine, and it comes down. So we had to push the axles out so that the wheels could still turn enough to kind of loop back on ourselves when we're combining, but obviously then that makes it wider for traveling down the road and getting through gateways and bits and pieces. So yeah, that was something to look at. Easy maintenance. In terms of operation, it was noisy. You didn't really hear that from the cab until you sort of reversed and swung round past a grain trailer or something like that, and it must have bounced back off another machine. So that would, yeah, but we didn't have no issues from any of the neighbours, which was quite good.
Yeah, great, fantastic. Well, gosh, time's rattling on. Let's bring in Trevor. Trevor, would you like to join us? If the three farmers could stay with us, please. Trevor, thank you very much for joining us. Could you just give a brief introduction as to who you are, first of all? I don't know whether you want to sort of come back on some of the issues that we've already raised within this.
Sure, I'll make a couple comments. First of all, thanks for having us part of this program, and a big thanks to BOFN and NIAB for organizing it. It's very tough when you're a Canadian-based company trying to develop a technology and then take it to other parts of the world, and you need to find good partners. And we have a great distribution partner in Oria, but we also need good research cooperators and collaborators. And so thanks to the farmers and NIAB and BOFN for all. Just a couple of comments. First of all, we're trying to tackle, in some sense, we're talking a lot about the agronomy side, and the farmers have touched a little bit on the mechanical side, but we're tackling two things with this project. Learning how combines are set up in the European market is different than how a combine would be set up in Australia or Canadian or US markets. And so especially, Ted and Adam, we had some growing pains, as they alluded to, in terms of learning how the drives and the fit and the finish had to be. Jake's maybe in a more fortunate circumstance because we've been working very intimately with John Deere. We have a great partnership with them, and so that's a factory orderable option. And so we've worked out those kinks many years ago. So thanks to the farmers for not only tackling the agronomic component of this, but also the mechanical side. But from our perspective, we're excited about this kind of data. I mean, it's important to us to be able to answer the question, not just where it works in a lab and what it kills in a lab condition. I mean, we can say as as Will said early in his presentation, you know, there's pretty good data to support that a 95+% kill rate of the material that goes to the mill is predictable, but it's how does that translate for the farm that you're on in terms of what you can put into the machine and the timing of that with your cropping conditions. And so all these research results are really important to us because we want to be able to help answer that question, when should you and when shouldn't you try to think about this as one of your parts. And again, Will's kind of touched on this. We see this as a key part of an integrated pest management approach to managing weeds on a farm. It isn't the solution to managing the weeds. It's not a replacement for all chemicals or all other agronomic practices. It's just one more tool that hopefully we can provide the farm operator to say, okay, if this fits, this will be another tool that you can use to try and get control and get on top, and then, you know, make better farm management decisions with the rest of it. So really encouraged that we saw some positive results. And as we saw, you know, with blackgrass, there's some unanswered questions, and we're thankful that we've got partners who are willing to continue to work on this, and we're committed to investing time and money as is our partner Aurea to continue to answer these questions. But yeah, I think we believe there's a strong fit. I think and the early data would suggest that. So we're excited to see where it continues to go, and really happy that we're able to get these early results.
Yeah, no, thank you very much, Trevor. And now I know that you and your team were working really hard to get things done, and I know that, I mean, one of the issues you had to deal with was that I believe Adams Combine, Class Combine, was the first in Europe to have a Redicott SCU fitted to it. What was were there any you know, sort of surprising problems that arose from this, and how did you address them?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things with the Claas Combine is, you know, we had a test machine here in North America that we used, but the information we got from, you know, our work didn't indicate that there was a very different drive system in the European market relative to the North American machines. You know, shame on us. We thought we had asked all the right questions, but we didn't. And so we had to scramble, and big thanks to Adam's local dealer to help us with that, to track down the right parts and to do the kind of conversion from the European drive to the North American drive to make it work. Now, going forward, we'll solve that problem. And the other issue Adam mentioned was, you know, the bypass. He's the one brand of combines where we can't turn the SCU on and off in the same way that we can with, say, Ted's New Holland or Jake's John Deere machine, or even the Case machine. We will have a solution for Adam for next season where he'll be able to kind of have on-off capability for that or for the Claas machine. But yeah, so there were some interesting learnings there in the mechanical side. But you know, those are solvable problems. I always find the mechanical ones are the easier ones. May not feel that way in the heat of the moment. Ted may have some comments on that, but I think the more important question is the agronomic ones, and that's why I'm so happy that Will is working with these guys to kind of answer those questions. Because if you're a farmer trying to make a purchase decision, you know, you're going to make the assumption mechanically it will work. Agronomically, that's the real piece that pays back dollars over the long period of time. So
yeah. No, and on that note, I'd like to bring Will back into the conversation as well. Will, if you'd like to join us, and let's have a look at some of the questions that have been coming in. Please do put the questions into the Q&A. By the way, this is being recorded, and the video will be available to you afterwards. So if you miss some of those crucial figures that you want to revisit, then you will get the opportunity to have a look at this at your leisure, so to speak. So do put your questions in, and thank you very much, Mike, for joining us. Now, Mike has asked, harvest was 2 weeks early this year. Was grass seed dropped black grass earlier this season as well? Will, what do you reckon?
Yeah, I would have said that it was a bit earlier, in line with earlier maturing crops. Yeah, I think that's certainly what I observed.
But that figure, over 50%, I think, wasn't it, of seed retention at harvest? I mean, even in you know, I thought it was about 10%, if I'm honest.
Yeah, so although possibly that is I mean, I would have said generally, my observations were that it was about normal. It was just a bit earlier,
Yeah.
but possibly there is this, the maturity is different in the crop and the weed, and possibly those two often they trend quite closely, but possibly this year maybe there's been some deviation, particularly with the weed. So yeah, it's an interesting observation for sure.
I'll just point out that was a really early harvested crop of Ixtays. It's a very early variety, so it was. It's not standard, I wouldn't say.
No.
I mean, you did the sampling yourself, I think, just before harvest.
Yeah.
Right. That was one aspect worth pointing out, that Will did the sampling, I believe, the previous sampling well before harvest, but the actual sampling the day before or a couple of days before harvest was done by the farmers yourselves. Adam, can I come back to you? Because I remember you tweeted, when you were picking your black rust. I mean, did you find it? How did you find actually sort of picking the, doing the weed monitoring?
It was quite easy. The brome was harder. The brome kept dropping out when I was trying to collect it, and quite a lot of seeds sort of fell out as I was trying to pull them off. So in the end, I just took a small pair of scissors with the black grass and just cut the ear off and then chucked it in an envelope. So yeah, it was quite easy. It wasn't too bad at all.
I don't know whether the other two farmers have got any sort of experiences of doing the weed monitoring itself, because this is something that perhaps we might look at in a future project. Try and get some more of this data on how much seed is standing at harvest. And I believe Will sort of gave you a protocol. Ted, what was your experience?
Very straightforward. When the combine arrived at a field, I'd have a walk a W of the field, harvesting ears. Similar problem to Adam, and I think it's the sheer intensity of heat that we all experience this harvest. I had to be very, very careful when taking the ryegrass ears. Yeah, not for a lot of seed to drop, but for something probably quite specific with ryegrass is its extended germination period in the spring. So we've got autumn established plants that are really, you've only got to brush them and you drop, and then right in the bottom of the crop you've got a ryegrass plant that's a few inches tall, but it's thrown ahead up to reproduce and set seeds. So we've got a good seed bank, and it is going to take time, but it's something that we've really got to stick at. But it's not a tricky thing to do, this sampling work, and keep at it. We're really
really valuable data we've got, but as you say, it's just a start. This is one season, 1 year. Fortunately, we've got 3 crops, 3 grasses that we've been looking at, but we need more data here, clearly. Richard Hull, thank you very much for joining us. And you've asked the question, did you sample the seed bank before the start of the project? Will, can I ask you to answer that one?
No, we didn't. It was part of a bigger scope of work, which I won't go into, but we didn't carry out. But I think we will probably towards the end of the project, whenever that is deemed the end, we will have you don't have the starting point at least, but at least we'll see where we've come to at that point, because I think that's where we will also put out those differences, but we're not just looking at above ground. Let's look at where we've got to on the below ground side of things.
Great. We've got a question from Yussi Napi. Thank you very much, Yussi, for joining us. I'm not sure about this question. So weed seed is often rich in different proteins, amino acids, and so on. Could these have an effect on soil microbes, maybe beneficial effects? Is this anything you've come across, Will?
I think I'd made a comment that I think in certainly no-till systems, we've got greater availability of weed seed on the soil surface, and therefore, this doesn't really answer the question, but it's always related, because if we've got seeds on the soil surface, seed predation is likely to be higher, or availability is higher. So we're going to have higher losses predicted as part of some work PhD at NIBA is undertaking in the next few years. And and therefore some of these seed losses in no-till systems. So it's higher from seed predation, which again sort of just chimes in with this transition towards regen, no-till systems, and our weed management. They don't necessarily have an effect on soil microbes, but there's possibly some beneficial effects for other vertebrates and invertebrates in the farming ecosystem. So, yeah.
Oh, well, thank you very much for that. Look, we're drawing to the end. I've just got a couple of things I want to say. If I can, first of all, I just want to sort of say thank you so much to our three farmers and to Trevor and to Will for all their time. Well, their time today, but also, of course, all their time to contribute to this project. I'm just going to share my screen briefly. Bear with me. Yeah, so as you know, we've got a knowledge cluster. You are the members of the knowledge cluster around this, and the whole idea of this knowledge cluster is that you should be involved in the project, and we want your involvement. So please do come back with your feedback. Come back to me. I'll also tell you a little bit about the Trinity GFP platform that we've got as well in a minute. So we will have webinars as well, so look out for the webinars, and we'll continue doing this. I hope that we will develop some on-farm activities that we'll be doing, and we were just talking earlier on about some weed monitoring. So one of the essential things that we've realized, if harvest weed seed control is going to be a viable form of control, we need to know how much viable seed is standing at harvest. And we simply don't have the data of that in UK conditions. So that's certainly something that we're looking at. As you've heard, Will has already sort of developed a protocol, a sort of prototype protocol, if you like, that the farmers have been trying out this year. That's something to look at and develop, and maybe we can get some really good, valuable data there. I've put up on there that we've potentially got a new project. We're hoping to get some funding for that, to take that forward. So look out for that in the coming months. We've also got some more data to come from this project itself, more data to process. And so look out for that as well. We'll be feeding that out over the months. And you will get to hear about it because you're our special people in our knowledge cluster. Now as I say, we do want to create this online community, what I'd oh, sorry, one thing I forgot to do, the poll. So what I'm looking for is some feedback on the poll. So what I'd like to know from you is what the key weed is for you that you believe harvest weed seed control would help you manage. And hang on, let me just bring up the poll. Bear with me. Oh, hang on a second. Relaunch poll. Yeah, can we see that? Would someone like to give me a thumbs up if you can see it? Jake, can you see it? Great, brilliant, fantastic. So what's the wrong question up here. I do apologize. So this is actually the second question. What is the key piece of information you need to find out before you know if harvest weed seed control will help you control your weed problem? So we're looking for the key piece of information you want. Would that be the proportion of weeds standing at harvest that we've discussed quite a bit in this webinar? Is it the operational costings? We heard quite a bit about that from the farmers themselves and from Will. Compatibility with the combine and practicality of use. We heard a few things about that and how that's going to be developing perhaps over the next year or so. And interaction with the tillage system. You heard from Will as to some of the data, previous data on this. So, you know, this element of no-till and non-inversion tillage. You know, whether you've got enough information on that. So, what is the key amount of harvest? And it looks as though it's this proportion of weed seed standing at harvest that's winning out. there. So I hope I can get the, I'm going to end this poll now. Thank you very much. Has everyone voted? Have you got any more votes to come in on this one? It looks as though it's a proportion of weed seed standing at harvest. We'll certainly act on that. Thank you very much for your information there. Let's go to the other one. Let me just. Yeah, so which weed is the priority weed for you? So this is the weed that it's a key weed for you, and one that you believe that weed seed control would help you manage as well. So two aspects there. So it's a key weed for you, but you also believe that harvest weed seed control would help you manage it. It looks as though it's neck and neck between blackgrass and ryegrass at the moment. Sterile brome and other grass weed in there as well. If you've got one thing I'd say actually is stick it in the chat or in the Q&A if you've got a particular weed in mind. Oh, we've got one broadleaf weed in there as well. So it has to be said, one of the aspects of this is that it's very useful in organic systems. And I know that in other countries, organic farmers have found it useful for broadleaf weeds. So that's great. Gosh, look at that. It's so blackgrass is leading the field there. We've got sterile brome on blackgrass about 30%, sterile brome 25%, ryegrass 19%, and other grassweed 19%. As I say, do put your comments into the chat or into the Q&A as to which grass weeds. And what I'll do is I will distribute the findings of the polls afterwards. So thank you very much for that. Finally, I'm aware we've gone slightly over time, so apologies. But I do want to point you to Trinity GFP, which is the platform on which we're going to be sharing the results of this project as we go forward. And having some feedback and discussion on it, and do welcome you to come onto that platform and to join in the discussion and to bring your experiences as well. And on that note, thank you very much for joining us on this webinar, on this results. As I say, we've got more results that we will be filtering out as we get them. And if you keep focused on GFP, look out for those BOFIN emails and we'll get them to you. But for the meantime, thank you very much for joining us and have a fantastic evening. Goodbye.